They said, "She's already gone." My own daughter's voice, steady and practiced, as if she had rehearsed those words in the car before walking into the ICU, as if pronouncing me dead while I was still warm, was nothing more than an administrative step. In her day, I heard it all, every syllable, every breath, every pause where she pretended to choke on grief she had never truly felt, and it cut through the dark fog of sedation, like a blade dragging across a surface that has already been wounded too many times. Even before I opened my eyes, before the beeping around my bed aligned itself into patterns I could understand, I knew exactly where I was and what had happened. And I knew that the one voice I had always believed would fight for me was the voice asking strangers in white coats to end me. That realization, that sharp and unmistakable betrayal, pulled me upward from the depth of my coma, long before anyone suspected I was listening and long before my body bothered to follow. I am 78 years old now, and sitting in the small living room of the place I rent, overlooking a narrow street where the same dog walker passes at exactly 7 every morning. And though my hands tremble slightly when I hold my tea, they know. Longer tremble from fear or disbelief. They tremble from effort, from the work of coming back into a world I was not expected to re-enter. The doctors call my recovery remarkable, a word they use when they do not want to say improbable, and I let them say it because it makes them feel heroic, and it costs me nothing. But the truth is simpler. I woke up because I refused to die in the presence of someone who wanted me gone. I woke because something deep within me, the part mothers keep hidden even from themselves, the part that remembers every sacrifice made and every disappointment swallowed, started burning the moment I heard my child speak of me as though I were a piece of furniture blocking a hallway, something inconvenient that needed to be removed for the sake of comfort. When people ask about it now, when nurses or neighbors tilt their heads with that soft, indulgent pity people reserve for the elderly who went through something traumatic, I do not correct them. I let them believe that what brought me back was love or faith, or the determination to see another spring. It sounds nicer that way, more digestible. But the truth is not sweet or tender. It is bitter and metallic, like the taste of my own blood on my tongue after they pulled the tube from my throat. I came back because I refused to let the last thing I heard on this earth be my daughter's quiet, almost bored request to surrender me. I came back because something inside me recoiled from her words so violently that my body, tired as it was, found a way to surface. The darkness was thick, oppressive, and strangely warm, a kind of silent cavern where I could float without being touched. And yet the moment she spoke, it cracked open, letting in a cold draft of awareness that made me feel alive in the most painful, humiliating way imaginable. The room where I sit now is small, but it is mine, and that difference is larger than the distance between life and death. The window is streaked with the fingerprints of sunlight, and sometimes I press my hand against the glass and feel the faint coolness beneath my palm, a reminder that I exist, that I am still capable of taking up space in a world that once nearly erased me with a signature and a nod. The chair beneath me creaks a little, not because it is old, but because my body is still learning its own weight again, recalibrating itself after weeks of being suspended between breath and nothingness. I often catch myself listening for the rhythm of the ICU monitors, the relentless beeping that told everyone I was still technically here. But now the only sound is the faint murmur of cars and the quiet settling of the walls at dusk. Some days I think about the moment before the collapse, before my heart stuttered and the world slipped sideways, and I remember it not with dread, but with a strange detachment, as if I were watching an old film of a woman who looks like me but whose life belonged to someone else. I see her walking through her kitchen, rinsing a mug, humming an old tune without realizing it, unaware that her daughter had been speaking to lawyers, unaware that her declining health had become a line item in someone else's spreadsheet, unaware of the cold efficiency with which her life had been evaluated and categorized. I see her reaching for a tea towel, a small and ordinary gesture, and then the sudden eruption of dizziness, the floor rushing up toward her knees, the sharp sting of ceramic breaking beside her. And then nothing. Silence. A hollow, weightless drift. But what happened next, what unfolded in the dark, was not the peaceful oblivion people like to imagine. It was a strange corridor of half dreams and half memories, a place where time bent and collapsed, where voices appeared as though carried through water. And her voice, my daughter's voice, was the one constant thread. Sometimes she whispered. Sometimes she spoke with the careful authority of someone talking to professionals she wanted to impress. And sometimes she sighed, long and impatient, as though waiting for an appointment to end. Her words were the rope pulling me back, not toward life, but toward awareness of what I had become in her eyes, a burden, a complication, a cost. Now, sitting here with my tea cooling in my hands, I can acknowledge the truth without flinching. I survived my own daughter. I survived her willingness to let me go, her eagerness even. And I survived the quiet, suffocating grief of realizing that love does not always bend toward care. Sometimes it bends toward convenience. Sometimes it shrivels. Sometimes it simply vanishes. And yet here I am, alive in a way I never expected to be again, not triumphant but steady, not bitter but awake. And this small living room, this quiet street, this thin line of breath, this is where my story truly begins. Not in the hospital bed where they thought I had already left, but here, where I learned that the cruelest words can become the fiercest. Reason to return. It happened in the kind of half-light that hospitals seem to manufacture on purpose, a dim, ambiguous glow that makes everyone look exhausted and every decision feel irreversible. And although my eyes were closed and my body lay, unmoving beneath the stiff white sheet, my mind drifted close enough to the surface to recognize that something monumental was unfolding around me, something sharp-edged and cold that would alter the shape of every relationship I had carried through. Decades of living, I remember the sensation first, an odd heaviness in the air, as though the room had inhaled but could not exhale. And then the presence of people shifting near my bed, their shoes squeaking softly against the polished floor, their voices quieter than usual, as if volume itself might tip fate in one direction or another. I could not speak or move, but I heard the doctor's measured tone as he explained my condition to the woman standing closest to him, the daughter whose hand once wrapped around my finger as a child and pulled me toward life, not away from it. He told her what the scans suggested, what the blood work implied, what their best guesses were, though he dressed all of it in language meant to sound gentle, as though gentleness could soften the truth that I hovered in the narrow space between the living and the gone, suspended in a stillness that felt strangely porous. He spoke of diminished chances, of weakened responses, of limited neurological activity, and each phrase drifted toward me through layers of fog until I found myself clinging to them, not because I understood them, but because they were evidence that I was still embedded in the world, still bound to the breath and pulse of the living. And then my daughter's voice cut through all of it, sharp not in volume, but in certainty, the certainty of someone who has already rehearsed her position in her mind, someone who has calculated the emotional cost and found it manageable enough to move forward. She asked the question I did not believe I would ever hear from her lips. The question that cracked open a hollow inside me, even before I could register its meaning fully. She wanted to know what would be required to let me go, to end the process that was keeping my lungs moving and my heart monitored, to remove the tubes and silence the machines so she could begin, as she phrased it, the next steps. The doctor paused, and in that pause I felt the weight of unspoken things filling the space. Between them, things too pragmatic to be cruel and too cruel to be pragmatic. And when he began explaining the legal considerations, the ethical guidelines, the decisions that needed signatures and witnesses, I understood that my daughter was not merely entertaining the possibility of my absence. She was preparing for it. I wanted desperately to reach up, not to embrace her or plead with her, but to touch her wrist, to remind her that beneath the pale sheet was a mother who had not yet surrendered, a woman who had not yet stepped aside to make room for death. Yet my hand did not move. My mouth did not open. My eyelids remained stubbornly sealed, trapping me in a darkness that felt increasingly like a coffin constructed from my own stillness. I listened as she told the doctor that I had always feared becoming a burden, twisting my private confessions into a justification for her convenience, using the vulnerability I had once shared with her as evidence that now, in this moment, my deepest wish would be to be released. She spoke of my loneliness, of my tiredness, of my age as if age were a disease and not simply the natural arc of a life that had been long and turbulent and full of battles I had chosen to fight. Her voice broke at the edges in a way that sounded almost genuine, but beneath it, I recognized something else, a fatigue that was not rooted in grief, but in obligation, and the quiet certainty of someone who believed the future would be simpler without me in it. When the doctor gently reminded her that my condition was not yet beyond all possibility, that small improvements sometimes appeared in cases like mine, her silence said more than any words could have. She did not ask how I might be helped. She did not ask whether more time could shift the prognosis. She asked instead how long these in-between states tended to last, how long families usually waited before decisions were finalized, how one determined when prolonging hope became, in her words, prolonging suffering. That word, suffering, curled strangely in my mind, because I could not tell if she meant mine or hers. The doctor answered with the practiced neutrality of a man accustomed to walking the razor's edge between science and mercy. But even through his restraint, I sensed discomfort, as if he sensed the imbalance between what was being said and what was truly meant. At some point, another voice entered the room, a nurse whose steps were much lighter than the rest, and she addressed me softly, touching my arm with a kind of warmth that startled me from within the dark. She spoke directly to me as if she believed I could hear her, which of course I could, telling me that she was changing my IV, that she hoped I was resting, that she would be there through her whole shift if I needed anything. This small kindness illuminated something inside me, a faint ember of selfhood that pulsed with recognition. Here was someone who treated me as present, not as an inconvenience or an item on a checklist of difficult family decisions. Her presence made the contrast more painful, clearer than any diagnosis. Strangers cared more for my life than the child I had given mine to. My daughter interrupted the nurse, apologizing with a cool politeness that suggested she did not see me lying there so much as she saw the outline of responsibility draped around me. They spoke over me, around me, past me, and the nurse hesitated once, her voice softening just slightly as she asked whether I had any advance directives on file. My daughter answered quickly, too quickly, telling her that she was the one authorized to make decisions, that everything would be handled appropriately. And in that tone, the brisk managerial certainty, I recognized the heart of the catalyst that would bring me back from the brink. It was not cruelty, at least not the theatrical kind. It was erasure. A quiet, efficient erasure of my agency, my history, my stubborn will to continue, replaced by her own narrative of what was best for me, what I would have wanted, what she was willing to tolerate. And in that moment, suspended between breath and silence, sensation and void, I realized that I was no longer fighting death. I was fighting disappearance. I was fighting the gentle, bureaucratic version of extinction that unfolds when someone decides your life has reached the limit of its usefulness. I felt a spark beneath the numbness, a protest rising not from fear but from defiance, and although my body remained heavy, my mind surged upward, clawing toward consciousness with a ferocity I did not know I still possessed. The catalyst was not the illness, nor the prognosis, nor even the dimming pulse of my own body. The catalyst was hearing the child I had raised, the child for whom I had stretched myself thin, calmly articulate the terms of my exit. And as the doctor continued explaining procedures and my daughter continued asking about timelines, something inside me whispered, "Not yet, not her way, not like this." In the days that followed those first unbearable conversations, while I still lay trapped inside a body that refused to answer even the simplest commands, the world around me seemed to settle into a rhythm that was both predictable and terrifying, a slow erosion rather than a collapse, the kind of decline that hides itself behind routine. I could feel myself hovering near the surface, never fully awakening, but no longer lost in the depth either. And in that strange twilight, I began to sense the subtle shifts in how people moved around me, how they spoke, how they paused, how carefully they modulated their concern. My daughter's visits, which in the beginning carried a veneer of urgency, soon became shorter and less purposeful, as though she had already spent the emotional energy she was willing to allocate to the situation. She no longer asked the doctor about possibilities of improvement. Instead, she asked about timetables, about expected plateaus, about the natural progression of cases like mine. And I listened as she tried to disguise her impatience beneath a tone of forced compassion that fooled no one, least of all me. It was during one such visit that I felt, rather than heard, her presence beside my bed, her perfume a faint echo of the one she used to borrow from my dresser when she was a teenager. She spoke to the nurse with a voice that carried the weight of exhaustion, though I wondered how someone could sound so worn out by a situation that required so little of her. I felt her fingers graze mine, not in tenderness, but as though she were confirming that I remained warm, confirming that the process was still ongoing, that nothing had shifted enough to require a change in the narrative she had begun building around. What my departure would mean. She told the nurse that she wished I could let go peacefully, and although the nurse responded with a patient neutrality, I sensed the woman's discomfort, the way she adjusted the blanket with more care than usual, as if the gesture itself could counterbalance the coolness in my daughter's words. That was the beginning of the slow unraveling, the moment when I understood that what was happening to me was not simply a medical crisis, but a quiet transition in the hearts of those who once insisted they could not live without me. The atmosphere around my bed thickened with a strange tension, a kind of ambient resignation that everyone seemed to share, except for the few kind souls whose instincts still leaned toward protection. I could recognize the footsteps of each nurse, the hurried ones who saw tasks rather than people, the gentle ones whose presence softened the air, and the rare ones who whispered to me under their breath, telling me stories of their days as if I were an old friend keeping them company during a long shift. These whispers pulled me upward, made me feel the shape of myself again, even when my limbs refused to obey me. But the whispers of the medical staff were nothing compared to the conversations that drifted in when they didn't think I was listening, the ones that were exchanged just outside my door, where professionalism wavered and honesty seeped out like steam through a crack. I heard a doctor murmur something about family dynamics and pressured decision-making, and though his voice was low, I caught enough to understand that he sensed my daughter's insistence was not solely born of concern. I tried to will my body to respond, to give them even the smallest sign that I had not vacated myself, that I was still lodged firmly inside this failing frame. But my fingers remained heavy, my eyelids anchored, my throat a silent chamber that refused to produce even a breath that differed from the machine's rhythm. That helplessness pressed on me more tightly each day, especially as I began to notice how my daughter's tone flattened, how she no longer attempted to mask the relief she felt when doctors gently hinted at unchanged status. She brought her laptop one afternoon, opening it on the corner table as if settling into a quiet workspace rather than a vigil by her mother's bedside. I listened as she typed, pausing only when the doctor entered to give updates, and it broke something inside me to realize that she responded to him with more authentic attention than she had given me in years. She asked him about forms, about expected timelines, and though she spoke in careful fragments, she had always been good at sounding appropriate. I could hear beneath her politeness the faint hum of someone preparing for a future without complication, a future in which my absence was not a tragedy, but an efficiency. Days blended into one another with an odd fluidity, and though I could not see the world around me, I felt its texture shift. My granddaughter visited once, her small hand slipping into mine with a gentleness that nearly pulled me awake. But she was quickly ushered out by my daughter, who said she didn't want the girl to be frightened. Yet I could hear the child whisper, but she squeezed my hand, and it took everything in me not to scream, to break through the paralysis and demand they listen to her. But no one believed the child, or perhaps no one wanted to, because belief would have complicated the narrative they had already accepted. It was easier to dismiss hope when hope came from a child's voice rather than a monitor's data. Little by little, my daughter's visits became more transactional. She discussed bills with nurses, insurance with administrators, funeral home brochures with someone over the phone who spoke with an oily, accommodating tone. She thought I couldn't hear, but the world of the unconscious is porous, and every word seeped into me like dye into cloth, staining the quiet darkness where my mind drifted. She spoke about my belongings, about closing my accounts, about how she would handle the house, and though she often couched these discussions in phrases like, "if it comes to that," the edges of her voice betrayed her expectation that That was exactly what would come. Eventually, she started speaking to me, not to comfort or communicate, but to justify herself, telling me that she didn't want me to suffer, that she wished things could be different, that she had her own family to think about, as if I hadn't spent decades thinking about mine with every breath I took. Each explanation was a small erosion, a wearing away of the bond I had believed could never be broken. This was the escalation, not dramatic, not explosive, but steady and quiet. The kind of emotional decay that happens when someone closes a door inside themselves and pretends they had no choice. And as she drifted further from me, I felt something inside myself begin to harden, not into anger, but into clarity, a clarity that revealed the truth with a painful brightness. I was alive, but she had already made peace with my death. And in that clarity, I felt the first stirrings of a resolve that my body had not yet caught up to. A resolve that whispered through the fog that if I ever reached the surface, if I ever took another breath of air that was mine alone, nothing between us would ever be the same. It was sometime in the middle stretch of those indistinguishable hospital days, when time had flattened into a continuous hum of machinery and muted footsteps, that something inside me shifted in a way I had not expected, a shift not marked by any dramatic surge of strength or sudden clarity, but by a subtle, nearly imperceptible rearrangement of my awareness. I had been floating for what felt like ages in that dim space between consciousness and oblivion, a place where sound arrived distorted and delayed, as though delivered through layers of cotton, and where my memories mixed with dreams until nothing held a definite shape. Yet in that blurred quiet, something began to change, not in the room around me, but within myself, like a small and stubborn thread pulling taut, refusing to snap despite the weight it carried. I remember hearing the soft scrape of a chair being moved closer to my bedside, followed by a voice I did not immediately recognize, a young, hesitant voice that lacked the practiced detachment of the doctor's or the strained efficiency of the senior nurses. She was new, I later learned, a trainee perhaps, unsure of her place among the more experienced staff. And she approached me with the kind of tentative kindness that has not yet been replaced by routine. She spoke to me quietly, unaware or unconvinced that I could hear her, telling me she hoped I was comfortable, that she would be taking care of me for the next few hours, that she liked evening shifts because the hospital grew softer at night, less frantic, less burdened by the chaos of daytime. She told me the weather outside was turning cold earlier than usual, that her mother had always said the first chilly breeze was a warning to prepare for change, and as she spoke, I felt an echo of something I had not felt in a long time. A presence, a sense of being regarded not as an object in decline, but as a person suspended in a moment of uncertainty. Her words did not awaken me, not physically, but they stirred something deeper, something that had folded itself inward under the weight of helplessness. She began reading aloud, not from a medical chart or a consent form, but from a small book she carried in her pocket. A slim volume of poems she said she liked because they grounded her, reminded her of why she had chosen to care for people in the first place. She read slowly, almost reverently, and though I could not remember the exact lines later, I remember how they sounded, soft and steady, like a gentle hand guiding me back toward the part of myself I had almost forgotten. For the first time since my collapse, I felt my thoughts take shape again, no longer drifting aimlessly, but gathering into something like intention. I realized that I was listening, not because I was trapped and had no choice, but because I wanted to. It was as if those words, spoken without expectation or urgency, reached into the dimness and drew me upward, reminding me that I had once been a woman with a mind, with opinions, with a voice that mattered. It seemed absurd that poetry could accomplish what medical intervention could not, and yet that is exactly what happened. The young nurse's gentle recital illuminated the narrow path between existence and disappearance, and I began to inch along it, not with my body, but with the part of me that refused to surrender. Her voice was soon joined by another presence, the night physician, an older man with a weary gait and an unexpectedly patient manner. He checked the machines, adjusted something near my head, and then, instead of addressing my daughter or the chart, he spoke directly to me. He told me that my vital signs had shown small but measurable improvements, nothing miraculous, nothing that would make headlines, but tiny shifts that indicated my body was not ready to relinquish the struggle. His tone carried neither false hope nor quiet resignation. It carried respect, the kind of respect that acknowledges the complexity of a life suspended between possibilities. He said it was too early to know what direction things would take, but that he believed in lingering potentials, in the stubbornness that sometimes emerges in people who have lived long enough to have seen sorrow and survived it. In that moment, his voice became a lifeline of sorts. Not because he promised recovery, but because he acknowledged that I was not gone. From that night forward, I began to sense the world more distinctly. The beeping of the monitor no longer blended into an indistinguishable pattern. I could discern its variations, its small hesitations, its quiet insistence that I was still tethered to something fragile, but real. I could feel the texture of the blanket on my skin, the faint pressure of the oxygen line against my cheek, the gentle shift of air when someone entered the room. More importantly, I began to notice my daughter's absence in ways that were almost liberating. Her voice, once a constant presence filled with tension and impatience, grew less frequent as she visited at odd hours or skipped days entirely, perhaps believing that time had taken over the work she had been too willing to perform. The space she left behind did not fill me with sadness or longing. Instead, it made room for a different awareness, one in which her desire to let me go no longer defined the boundaries of my fate. As the slow reconnection between my senses and the world continued, I found myself drifting not into darkness, but into memory, revisiting moments from my life that had laid dormant beneath years of habit and expectation. I saw myself as a young woman holding my daughter for the first time, felt again the overwhelming terror and love of that moment, recalled how fiercely I had protected her from every imagined threat. I remembered how she used to cling to my hand when crossing the street, trusting entirely that I would keep her safe. And then I saw the years when she grew older, more distant, reshaped by disappointments I never fully understood. And I realized that somewhere along that path, she had begun to see me less as a mother and more as a weight she was destined to carry. These memories hurt, but they also illuminated the truth. I had spent so many decades living for others that I had forgotten how to live for myself. And now, lying there between silence and awakening, I had nothing left to lose by choosing myself for the first time. The change was not dramatic. It did not arrive with a rush of adrenaline or a sudden clarity of vision. It came as a slow, deliberate shift in my own thinking, a realization that I was still here because I wanted to be, not because someone else needed me, not because duty compelled me, but because some quiet, resilient part of me had refused my daughter's verdict. I began to push against the darkness with a determination that surprised even me. I focused on the weight of my limbs, on the twitch of a muscle near my thumb, on the faint flicker behind my eyelids, as if gathering evidence of my own existence. And then, one night when the room was still except for the soft rustle of the nurse adjusting my pillow, I felt the faintest movement ripple through my fingers, a tiny, trembling shift that would have gone unnoticed by anyone not watching closely. But she saw it. She gasped softly, leaned in, and whispered that she believed in me, that she had seen the spark returning. In that instant, the world brightened ever so slightly, and I felt myself tipping toward life, not out of obligation, not out of desperation, but out of a quiet, unyielding resolve. I was not done yet. The shift from quiet awakening to open pressure did not arrive with fanfare. It slipped in like a draft under a closed door, noticeable first only to the part of me that had begun to wake up and take inventory. After that small movement of my fingers, the one the young nurse had noticed and whispered about with such gentle excitement, there were a few days when the energy in the room grew cautiously hopeful. I could feel more hands on me, hear more focused conversations at my bedside, and sense a certain fragile curiosity in the way people spoke, as if they were testing the edges of a new possibility without wanting to commit to it fully. The night physician came more frequently and addressed me as if my participation in the conversation were assumed rather than theoretical, noting each minuscule change in my reflexes, each fractional improvement in my breathing pattern, each flutter of my eyelids that might signal the beginning of my return. Those tiny acknowledgments fed a quiet fire in me, and I responded not with dramatic leaps of progress, but with persistent effort, trying each day to push the envelope of control a little further, to coax my body into obeying the will that had taken root inside me. Yet hope, I have learned, does not simply push despair aside. It must contend with it, and in my case, despair had taken on the familiar face of my own child. One afternoon, when the light filtering through the blinds was thin and the air felt heavy with the residue of cleaning chemicals and exhaustion, I sensed the particular tension that always preceded her arrival. Even without seeing her, I knew when she entered the room, because the air changed, grew tighter, as if it had been pulled across sharp edges. Her perfume drifted toward me, a scent I used to buy for her birthday, now mixed with the faint sterile smell of hand sanitizer, and her footsteps came to a stop at my side with a decisiveness that made my fingers curl inside my mind, even if they did not yet curl in reality. She greeted the nurse briskly, no trace of warmth in her tone, and soon the conversation shifted to the subject that had become her quiet obsession: length of stay, prognosis, and what she once again called quality of life. The nurse, bless her, tried to interject a note of optimism, mentioning that I had shown more responsiveness, that they had documented increased reflexes and a stronger reaction to stimuli. But my daughter brushed it aside with a kind of polite impatience that had always been more cutting than outright anger. She said she had read articles, that she understood there was something called a vegetative state and something else called minimal consciousness, that people could linger in these in-between conditions for months or years, and she spoke the word linger as if it were synonymous with rot. Her voice trembled slightly, and to an outsider it might have sounded like emotion, but I, who had heard that tremor when she argued with customer service representatives or negotiated interest rates, recognized it as something else: the frustration of a person whose plans were being delayed. She did not shout or cry or accuse anyone of negligence. Instead, She used the language of concern, wrapping her impatience in sentences that began with, "I just don't want her to suffer," and "she wouldn't want this." And with each repetition of those phrases, I felt another piece of our shared history weighed and repurposed as evidence against my continued existence. At one point, she asked to speak to the doctor in private, but in a hospital there is no such thing as true privacy. Walls are thin, curtains are symbolic, and voices carry. I listened as they stepped just outside my door, the sounds of their shoes on the linoleum marking their distance, but not their words. She asked, again, about the process of withdrawing life support, about what it would mean, about how it would look, and I heard the doctor respond with the same careful neutrality as before, explaining that while my condition was still serious, the recent signs of increased responsiveness complicated the situation. He mentioned ethics, protocols, guidelines. He said that when there is evidence of improvement, however small, decisions of that magnitude are approached with extreme caution. There was a pause, long and heavy, and then she asked a question that made something in my chest feel like it was trying to stand up inside my ribcage. She wanted to know whether the medical team could be overestimating the significance of those tiny changes because they were reluctant to have a difficult conversation with family. She suggested that perhaps they were prolonging the inevitable out of fear, and that she did not want my last days. She spoke as if the outcome were a foregone conclusion, to be consumed by what she called false hope. I would have laughed if I had been able, because the idea of me, lying motionless and mute, being the center of anyone's false hope was almost comical. The only hope being challenged was my own, a hope I nurtured quietly in the dark, fueled not by statistics or charts, but by the simple, stubborn refusal to let her be the one who decided when my story ended. The doctor, to his credit, pushed back gently. He pointed out that while no one could guarantee a full recovery, and while the likelihood of my returning to the exact version of myself I had once been was slim, the presence of emerging responses meant that my brain was not as silent as initial scans had suggested. He reminded her that medicine is not an exact prophecy, that they had an obligation to respond not only to worst-case probabilities, but also to unfolding realities. Her tone cooled at that, and she began to press on a different front. She spoke of my age, my existing health issues, the burden on the healthcare system, the emotional toll on her and her family. And as she listed these factors, I felt myself being reduced, item by item, to a sum of inconveniences and liabilities. She mentioned that she had been handling my finances before all this happened, that she knew the extent of my resources, and that I had once confided in her my fear of outliving my savings and being forced into indignity. She leaned heavily on that confession, twisting it into justification, saying I would never have wanted to drain what little remained on a half-life in a hospital bed, as she put it. It was true that I had worried about such things. What was not true was that I would have chosen this moment, when my mind was fighting its way back through the fog, to concede defeat for the sake of tidy accounting. As their conversation wore on, I became aware of another presence in the hallway, a softer set of breaths and the faint rustle of clothing against the wall. It took me a moment to realize that someone else was listening too, someone smaller, someone who shifted their weight nervously from one foot to the other. It was my granddaughter, allowed into this world of fluorescent lights and clipped conversations for reasons I still do not understand. She heard her mother's words and the doctor's responses, and then, in a small voice that broke my heart even more than anything else that day, she asked if I was still in there, if Grandma could hear them. The doctor answered kindly, telling her that sometimes people in my condition could hear and understand more than they were able to show, that speaking to me as if I were listening was always the right thing to do. My daughter tried to redirect her, telling her that this was complicated, that she was too young to understand. But the girl persisted, asking why they were talking about letting me go if I might still be there. Her question hung in the air like a fragile ornament, glittering with the kind of raw, unfiltered logic that children often wield without realizing how sharp it is. No one answered her directly. Instead, I heard the scraping shuffle of movement as my daughter guided her away, murmuring something about getting a snack or going to the waiting room. The doctor re-entered my room alone, and for a moment I thought he might speak to me again, but instead he simply adjusted my pillow and checked the machines in silence. His hands gentle, but his shoulders weighted by the conversation he had just endured. When he left, the room felt emptier than it had in days, and yet inside me, something had solidified, not into despair, but into a clear, cold recognition. My fight was no longer only against the weakness of my own body. It was against the quiet, persistent narrative my daughter was weaving in every hallway, in every meeting, with every signature she was so ready to provide. In the next few days, the pressure grew in ways that were less visible but more insidious. I heard her on the phone with other relatives, painting a picture of me as someone already gone, someone whose brief signs of response were more like nervous twitches than proofs of presence. She used phrases like, "It's what she would want," and "I'm trying to be strong," casting herself as the brave gatekeeper of my dignity, while simultaneously considering options for my belongings, my house, my accounts. She spoke to a social worker about legal matters, asking whether there was anything else she needed to sign, anything else to prepare. And though the social worker's responses were cautious, the implication was clear. She wanted this process, completed neatly and efficiently under the guise of compassion. All the while, the nurses who believed in the small sparks they saw kept talking to me, telling me the date, the weather, the shift changes, as if they were anchoring me to the continuum of ordinary life. One of them began to place my hand on a soft ball, encouraging my fingers to curl around it, and though the movement was clumsy and slight, I felt the flickers of control like distant signals from a lighthouse. Each time I managed even the smallest squeeze, she praised me in a voice that trembled with genuine excitement, promising she would note it in my chart so the doctors would see. I clung to these moments, storing them up like evidence for a trial I was not yet allowed to attend. Then came the meeting I had sensed was inevitable, a gathering of people whose footsteps I recognized, but whose purposes I could only infer. There were more voices this time, more chairs being moved, a more formal tone. An ethics consultant, someone with a calm, measured voice, spoke about values, about autonomy, about the complexity of making decisions for someone who could not currently speak for herself. My daughter repeated her familiar refrain. I would not want to live like this. I feared dependency. I had always valued my independence. I would prefer a peaceful end over a prolonged uncertainty. She was not entirely wrong. Those thoughts had crossed my mind many times over the years. What she did not understand, or perhaps what she refused to acknowledge, was that the person who had occasionally voiced those fears in late-night conversations had also been fierce, stubborn, and inclined to change her mind when confronted with real, tangible choices. Hypothetical dignity is one thing. The actual chance to feel the sun on your face again, to hear your own voice, to decide for yourself, is another. The consultant asked whether I had ever recorded my wishes in writing, whether there was an advance directive or a living will that could guide them. My daughter admitted there was nothing formal, only conversations. That admission opened a crack in the wall she'd been building, and through that crack, I felt air slip in. Without a written directive, my supposed wishes were interpretations, and interpretations could be questioned. The consultant suggested that, given the documented signs of increased responsiveness and the lack of explicit instructions, the ethically sound approach was to continue supportive care and reassess over time, especially since there was no imminent crisis forcing immediate action. My daughter's frustration was palpable even from where I lay, still and mute. She tried to argue, to frame the delay as cruelty. But the more she pushed, the more her motives became visible, if not to everyone in the room, then at least to those who were attuned to nuance. For me, this was the turning of the screw, the moment when I understood that the storm was not passing but intensifying, and that my survival, if it came, would not come with celebration, but with resentment from the person I had once thought would be most grateful. The pressure she exerted did not drive me back into the darkness. It drove me further toward the light, because I knew now, with a clarity that left no space for nostalgia, that I could not return to the world as the same woman who had entered this bed. If I woke, it would be as someone who had seen, from the inside, how easily a life can be weighed and found inconvenient. It would be as someone who no longer confused duty with love or sacrifice with safety. As the days stretched and the conversations continued, I kept working in the only way I could, breath by breath, twitch by twitch, thought by thought. I listened to every word, every sigh, every legal term and medical phrase, and I translated them into fuel. I let my daughter's impatience, her talk of ending what she called my limbo, feed a resolve that grew quieter and denser with each passing hour. She believed she was the one preparing to close a chapter. What she did not know was that I was preparing too, not for an ending, but for the beginning of a life in which her voice would no longer be the one that decided whether I stayed or went. The moment when my mind finally surged forward with enough force to pull my body behind it was not accompanied by any blinding vision or triumphant burst of energy. It came quietly, like a tide shifting under the surface, almost imperceptible until it began to move everything in its path. I remember a morning in the ICU when the light seemed different, not brighter, not warmer, but sharper somehow, as if it had carved out a narrow channel through which I could reach the world more directly. The sounds around me were clearer than they had been in weeks. The rhythmic hiss of the ventilator, the soft rattle of a cart being pushed down the hallway, the clipped tones of nurses exchanging information during shift change. And then there was a voice, my daughter's voice, entering the room with the unmistakable cadence of someone who had already made up her mind. She spoke to a doctor, telling him she wanted to revisit their previous discussions, that she believed it was time to transition my care, and that she hoped they could honor her mother's dignity by not dragging out what she referred to as an inevitable decline. The doctor hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but out of caution, explaining that I had shown consistent signs of improvement, that the small movements documented by the night staff were meaningful, and that there was reason to think I might soon cross the threshold into full consciousness. Her silence in response was taut, and then she exhaled sharply, the way she used to when something inconvenienced her schedule or contradicted her expectations. She said she did not want to cling to false hope, that she had seen people linger like this before, and that it was cruel. And as she spoke, I felt a surge of something fierce rise through me, something that pushed against the fog, that had weighed my eyelids down for so long. I tried to lift them, willing them to open, but the effort only produced a small tremor that was barely perceptible even to me. Still, that tremor traveled inward, igniting a sense of determination that felt almost physical, as if my very bloodstream had thickened with resolve. My daughter moved closer to the bed, leaning over me with a sigh that was meant to sound sorrowful, but instead carried an unmistakable note of impatience. She touched my arm lightly, an obligatory gesture, and told me that she loved me, that she was trying to do what was best, that she hoped I understood. But what she wanted me to understand was not love. It was resignation, a resignation she expected me to share. She told the doctor she was ready to sign whatever needed signing, and when he reminded her that decisions like this required careful reevaluation given my recent changes, she pressed him again, her tone firm and controlled, as if she believed persistence alone could reshape reality. In that moment, something inside me surged upward with such force that I felt my throat constrict, not in pain, but in effort. I tried to speak, to force out even the faintest sound, but the muscles refused to obey, and the frustration of that failure sparked a heat in my chest that burned brighter than any emotion I had felt in months. The nurse entered then, the same young woman who had read to me in those early nights, and as she adjusted my pillow, she seemed to notice something in my expression, some flicker beneath the stillness. She leaned close and whispered that she believed I was trying, that she could see it, and that I should keep pushing. And those words washed over me like a current, strengthening the part of me that had clawed its way back from the dark. My daughter did not hear her. She was too busy outlining her reasoning to the doctor, gathering her arguments like someone preparing for negotiation rather than a final farewell. She spoke of my independence, my pride, my fear of incapacity, twisting these truths into a narrative that served her convenience. The doctor remained calm, gently reiterating that improvement altered the ethical considerations, but she countered by questioning the significance of those tiny signs and whether they were enough to justify prolonging the process. When he asked her to clarify what she meant by process, she faltered, just for a second, revealing far more than she intended. That small pause sparked something in me, an understanding that she was not driven by compassion, but by the desire to move forward, unburdened. It was then, in that thin crack of silence, that I felt a shift unlike any before. My breath quickened, not because the machine demanded it, but because I demanded it. My fingers tingled, the faintest vibration spreading through them like an electric pulse. I focused all my strength on that sensation, gathering it, channeling it, until I felt one finger twitch, then another, and the nurse gasped softly, calling the doctor's attention. He leaned over me, his brow furrowed, watching closely as my eyelids fluttered with a determination that felt almost violent from the inside. I pushed again, harder this time, and the world around me flickered like a dim room where someone had turned the lights on too suddenly. My daughter stepped backward, perhaps startled, perhaps annoyed, I could not tell. But she asked what it meant, her voice tight. The doctor told her quietly that it meant I was trying to wake up, that I was responding with intention, and that these were not involuntary spasms but deliberate efforts. She protested, insisting that she had not seen anything of the sort before, as if my awakening were a personal inconvenience rather than a miracle. And the doctor, with a calm firmness that surprised me, told her that things had changed, that I was no longer a candidate for the decisions she had been discussing. Something in her voice cracked then, fear, frustration, perhaps both, and for a moment she said nothing at all. I gathered all the strength left in me and pushed my eyelids open. The world slammed into me at once. Bright lights, blurry shapes, a burning dryness in my throat. The overwhelming sensation of having been submerged for too long and suddenly breaking the surface. The doctor leaned into my line of vision, speaking softly, encouraging me, telling me I was doing wonderfully. And the nurse squeezed my hand with a warmth that felt like an anchor, pulling me into the moment. My daughter's face appeared behind them, pale, stricken, her mouth slightly open, as if she were witnessing something she had not prepared herself to confront. She whispered my name, not with relief, but with a kind of stunned disbelief, as though the script she had been rehearsing had suddenly been ripped out of her hands. I wanted to speak, to direct my voice toward her for the first time in what felt like years, but the tube down my throat made that impossible. Instead, I looked at her, held her gaze as steadily as I could, letting her see that I was present, that I had heard everything, that I had not drifted away into oblivion as she had hoped. The doctor explained that the next step would be assessing my ability to breathe on my own, and as they prepared to remove the tube, I felt both terror and exhilaration coursing through me. When they finally pulled it out, my body convulsed with coughing, my throat raw and burning. But through the pain, I forced out a single sound, a rasp of breath shaped into the beginning of a word. Her name. The room shifted then. The nurse steadied me. The doctor monitored my breathing, and my daughter stepped forward, her eyes wide with something that might have been guilt or fear or some tangled combination of both. She reached for my hand, but this time I moved it away, not with anger, not with violence, but with the deliberate clarity of someone reclaiming agency. I watched her face as the truth settled in, as the realization dawned that the woman she had been preparing to bury was now alive, awake, and fully aware of what had transpired around her. Later, when they asked me to communicate by squeezing their hands, I did so with unmistakable intention. When they asked me to blink once for yes and twice for no, I responded with perfect clarity. And when they asked whether I wanted my daughter to remain my designated medical proxy, the question that had been hovering in the air since the moment I opened my eyes, I blinked twice, slowly and deliberately, refusing her that power with the calm certainty of someone who had seen her own death rehearsed too many times by someone she once trusted. It was not revenge. It was not anger. It was the simple, irrevocable act of taking my life back into my own hands. When I finally left the hospital, escorted not by my daughter but by a quiet social worker who spoke to me with a respect I had not felt in a long time, the world seemed almost unbearably large, filled with ordinary sounds that struck me with the force of revelation, the distant rumble of traffic, the rhythmic turning of a crosswalk signal, the soft murmur of strangers passing by, unaware that a woman who had been nearly erased was now taking her first steps back into herself. The air tasted different too, colder, sharper, carrying a clarity that felt both cleansing and uncomfortably honest, as if everything I had endured had peeled away the last illusions I once held about love, duty, and the fragile expectations we place on those we call family. I moved slowly, supported by a cane and the careful guidance of my physical therapist, but with each step, something inside me settled, not in defeat, but in a quiet acceptance that the life I was returning to would not resemble the one I had left behind. In the weeks that followed, as I learned again how to sit without dizziness, how to lift a cup without trembling, how to steady my breath when memories of the ICU washed over me without warning, I also began the quieter work of rebuilding the interior spaces of my life. The apartment I chose was small but filled with sunlight, a place where I could feel the day changing by the temperature of the light alone. I placed my plants on the windowsill, willing them to survive the way I had, and watched them lean eagerly toward the sun, as if they, too, understood the meaning of returning after a long absence. People visited me, neighbors, a few old friends who had thought I would not recover, nurses who brought warm smiles and gentle conversation on their days off. But my daughter stayed away, waiting perhaps for an invitation or absolution that never came. I did not deny her out of malice. I simply no longer felt responsible for soothing the discomfort she had created for both of us. There were moments when I found myself remembering her as a child, her small hand clutching mine on the way to school, her tearful nights when she crawled into my bed, seeking comfort from storms or nightmares. Those memories did not vanish. They simply settled into place like artifacts from a past life, reminders of who she had been before adulthood carved away her softness. Yet whenever nostalgia threatened to wash over me with its familiar sweetness, I reminded myself of the woman who had stood at my bedside and declared me already gone. I reminded myself that love without presence is a fragile fiction, and presence without care is a burden masquerading as loyalty. In that recognition, I found not bitterness, but a strange, liberating calm. One afternoon, months after my discharge, I received a letter from her. The handwriting was careful, as if each letter had been shaped with deliberation, and the tone was earnest in a way she had not spoken to me in years. She wrote that she was glad I had recovered, that she hoped I was finding comfort and strength, and that she wished we could talk when I felt ready. Reading it, I felt neither anger nor relief, only a soft ache, like the echo of an old bruise. I placed the letter in a drawer, not to discard it, but to keep it where it could live without demanding anything from me. Healing, I have learned, sometimes means refusing to reopen certain doors, even if the person on the other side claims to knock with good intentions. As my strength returned, I found myself taking longer walks, feeling the ground beneath my feet with a wonder that no one around me could possibly understand. The simple act of moving through the world on my own terms felt like a triumph, not because it erased what had happened, but because it reclaimed something that had nearly been taken: my agency, my voice, my right to exist without someone else. Narrating my end, I began writing again. Not letters, not journals, but small reflections on scraps of paper that I tucked into books or left on my kitchen counter. Reminders that I was here, thinking, choosing, continuing. Sometimes, when the evening light hit just right, I read them aloud to myself, hearing a steadiness in my own voice that I had thought lost. There were days of sorrow, too. Quiet afternoons when the weight of betrayal sat heavily on my chest, and I wondered how a bond forged through childbirth and decades of intertwined living could fracture so completely. But sorrow, unlike despair, has a softness to it, a gentleness that allows space to breathe. I let it move through me without letting it drown me, and each time it faded, I found myself clearer, lighter, more certain of who I was now. I did not seek revenge or reconciliation. I sought only peace, and day by day it arrived in small, steady increments. Sometimes, when I catch my reflection in the window, I see a woman shaped by survival more than age, someone who learned the hardest truth late in life, that not everyone who claims to love you knows how to stand beside you when it matters. And yet I also see strength there, a quiet kind that does not announce itself. I survived not because someone fought for me, but because something deep within me refused to let my story end in someone else's voice. That knowledge steadies me more than any apology ever could. And if I could speak to another woman standing on the edge of being forgotten, erased, or decided for, I would tell her this. Your existence does not depend on anyone's permission. Your breath, your will, the stubborn spark inside you, those are yours alone, and no one has the right to declare you gone while you are still fighting to return. Hold on to that spark, however small it may feel. It is enough. It is everything.